we'll get started and get rolling here. So hi everyone, Chris Figgins in an unusual situation. Normally I'm waiting to say hi to you guys all in the vineyard in October when we do our annual release party, but decided to obviously do a webinar this year, and I'm pleased to have with me Chris Tanghe, Master Sommelier, and Chris is joining us from Vashon, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Awesome. So good to have you. Chris is one of we're blessed in Washington State to have a handful of master sommeliers in the state. I think what, 5 or 6, Chris, including yourself?
Let's see. I think there's 7 now. Yeah, we've had a few pass in the last 3 or so years. So yeah, there's a really high concentration, which is unusual. It used to be kind of like Las Vegas and a few other major cities, and now everything's kind of changed and spread out a bit. So yeah, Seattle.
It's awesome. It kind of, I think, goes hand in hand with our, domestic wine industry and our awesome restaurants and everything else. So for those of you who don't know, passing the Master Sommelier exam is a pretty extraordinary feat in its own right, and requires, years and years of study and diligence and studying the world's wine regions. So Chris really brings a pretty unique perspective on where Washington wines, Walla Walla wines fit in the scheme of the scheme of the wine world. So and we'll talk a little bit about that today. So we are celebrating the release. Tuesday, got the email of our 2017 Figgins. Really excited to get the wine out. Wish it was under different circumstances, but everyone apparently is drinking quite a bit at home. If you look at the national sales numbers, for direct-to-consumer type sales, they're up across the country. So everyone, thank you for doing your part and supporting wineries who don't have restaurants to sell to and whatnot. Those have been massive changes. So Chris, why don't you kind of start, and give your perspective, if you will, on, where you see Washington wines fitting in the world and domestically, and how they've kind of gotten on the map, not just on the Northwest, but elsewhere.
Yeah, I think I'm not from Washington originally, but I've lived here, 15 years now, and it's been really awesome to see it grow. And have worked in the wine industry the entire time that I've been here. It's when I first moved here, it started to become a big focus for me, and so I grew along with the industry growing, and it's so neat to see it have such an impact on. Not only nationally, but internationally too. I judge a number of competitions around the world, and Washington wines are starting to appear there, in Europe and Southern Hemisphere, Australia, etc. So it's really, really, it makes me quite proud, even though I'm not from here, but seeing the change over the years and the impact that it's made on the world of wine period is really impressive. I work in education for my day-to-day job, and done a number of classes on Washington, and everyone's always super excited to learn about Washington because it is really new for a lot of people. If you've ever, what's that Greggett book? Forget the name of it. Anyways, he talks about, in the early days going around and trying to educate about Washington wine, and everyone thought he'd be talking about Washington, D.C., and now that's definitely not the case. People know it. People are excited to taste it. And I think one of the biggest strengths of it is its diversity of styles and varieties. I mean, we can make anything like, really delicious sparkling wine, to really taut white wines, to rich white wines, to lean red wines, rich red wines. So then there's a lot of experimentation going on too, especially with the newer generation of winemakers and all the AVAs really. And in terms of the AVAs, we have a lot going on too, where there's been a lot of establishment of new AVAs in the last 15 years, and continues to happen, and will continue to happen more, even more recently. Sorry, I'm outside. There's an occasional car that goes by. So we just had, like, for instance, the Royal Slope AVA gets confirmed very recently. So it's neat to see the changes and to see the respect that it's garnered throughout the years.
Yeah, very cool. For those, you guys see one extra box in there, which is Carly Knowles. A lot of you know Carly personally. She's our direct-to-consumer director for Figgins Family Wine Estates. A lot of you talked to her on the phone if you haven't seen her in person. She'll hop on later, but she will be fielding questions. We'll do some Q&A at the end, 20 minutes of that. And just use the chat feature you have. If you have any questions about orders, anything else, Carly's the person, but use that chat feature, and then she'll filter questions and get them to me at the end for some Q&A. So you guys might be curious what you're seeing on the screen. That is, I did not take that photo. I wish I knew who I could give credit to. That was taken about 48 hours ago, actually in Newberg, Oregon. That's in the Chehalem Mountains area. And we have a vineyard over there that, thanks to, for my Toil, Oregon project, unrelated to, not directly related to Figgins, but part of Figgins Family Wine Estates. And we had a fire get within about half mile of our vineyard. And that's a pretty amazing scene right there where you see the marine air trying to battle against the, you know, the fires that are underlit. And so pretty amazing what's going on in Oregon, and really feel for people that are losing homes and cabins and businesses. So pretty scary. And, you know, we can talk about that, you know, climate and whatnot and how it's affecting things, but I thought I'd jump in a little bit and talk a little bit about Figgins and just the why of it. And this is actually on the well house at Figgins. When my dad and I, you know, he did a very awesome thing in teaching me, like with Leonetti. He's always had this saying, which is dirt foot. He'd write it on things. And dirt foot means do it right the first time. And we tend to approach our business like that. If we're building a label, if we're building a building, we're building a vineyard, we try and do it right the first time and do it in a way that's forever and generationally thinking. So my wheelhouse is actually built out of some salvaged stone from an old root cellar that was being torn down by a neighbor. And I put a quote on there that also kind of shows how important sustainability is to me. It's very important, and being on the well house, I just thought it was a good quote to just, you know, always be a reminder to my viticulture staff, like, you know, to be mindful of water and resources and everything else. So that's why that's there. This is the Figgins Vineyard itself. And those of you who've been there know how special a site it is. When I found this vineyard site, it's kind of a fun story. I was up the Mill Creek drainage fishing, and this is Mill Creek down on the bottom here. It's one of the two drainages that come into, major drainages that come into the Walla Walla Valley. The other, of course, is the Walla Walla River on the south side of the valley. But I was up there fishing one day, and I must credit my dad with always looking at this south-facing slope and just pointing to it. It's about a 4-mile stretch and saying, this is the spot in Walla Walla. And we have our upland vineyard is just around the hill that all goes into Leonetti. But when this came up for sale, I literally saw a for sale sign that had gone in. I pulled it out and put it in the back of my truck because I didn't want anyone else to see the for sale sign. And none of the land around here ever comes up for sale. It's very rare because they're all in like long-term family trusts and things like that. So I was able to buy this piece of property. You know, I approached my parents. This is in 2004. And we had gotten Leonetti to where we were 100% estate grown. We didn't need any more fruit because we had our vineyards, the size and the brand, the size that we wanted it. But I felt so strongly about this being my dream vineyard site that had to have it, had to plant it, and talk to my folks. And they're like, you know, good luck, you're on your own. You know, we don't need this for Leonetti. And they were right. So I endeavored to plant Figgins, and I approached it, you know, when you look at the Figgins bottle, if you start, you know, looking for varietals, you won't find it. That's quite intentional. When I approached planting the vineyard and building the brand, I wanted it not to be about, is it Merlot, is it Cabernet, about a varietal wine like we do at Leonetti. I wanted it to be just about the place, you know, the four walls of the vineyard. And so, you know, and that's very much more of a European mindset. If you go to Bordeaux, you go to Piemonte, you go to Burgundy, the varietal is it's inconsequential. It of course is in the finished wine, but it's less important than where it's from. Not what is it, but where is it from? And then you get into the trivia. Okay, well, right bank of, Bordeaux is typically Merlot dominated, left bank's Cabernet dominated, that sort of thing. So that's the way I approached Figgins when I laid it out. It was a wheat field like the ones you see surrounding, and took each of the various panels of the vineyard and planted them to the varieties that I thought would most excel on those individual panels. So for instance, if you see my cursor on the screen, the Merlot is all planted down here in the bottom in the lower elevations. And then it's Cabernet up in the higher elevations. And then in my kind of most frost-free slope up here is the Petit Verdot, because it's very late ripening. So it's those three varieties that go into the wine. It's usually predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon, but Merlot and Petit Verdot make up the mix in the other years. So in warmer years, like 2017 was a decently warm year, kind of an in between. Years like 15 tend to have a lot of Petit Verdot, where it's a hot year, and cooler years, like say a 2011, 2010, have higher amounts of Merlot in them because it's an earlier ripener. So it does vary a bit by the year.
Hey, Chris,
So,
as a layperson, looking at this picture, it's like there's wheat all around, like you said, right? So when you drove by and you saw that sign for sale, that for sale sign, excuse me, and you were like, what about this site did you know that was special? And was it the positioning? Was it the aspect? Was it the soil? What really stood out to you? What made you jump on it and want it so badly?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So, I had some history. Planted the Leonetti Vineyard, which is just to the west of this, or Mill Creek Upland Vineyard in 97. And so I knew how high the potential was off the area, and very much wanted to expand upon that, but there was simply no land available. But what appealed to me about this is, one, its elevation. So it's kind of deceiving in this photo, but here in the bottom left-hand corner is 1,750 feet. It's one of the highest elevation vineyards of any consequential size in the state, and the bottom's 1,500. So this makes it look kind of flat because it's taken from an airplane, but there's 250 feet of fall there. So, and it falls directly to kind of the southwest, which in this part of the valley, where it's a cooler part of the valley, is ideal orientation. So this picture is taken just before sunset, and you can see some of for instance, the north-facing slopes across the way, across the creek are shadowed already. So this is kind of, a piece that gets the last of the evening sun. So it has a really long day length. Has very deep soils. The soils in the area are this deep windblown loess. And I just love the way the property laid, the way it drained. It's roughly convex, and I always love convex vineyard sites. In fact, if you look across our Leonetti vineyards, with the exception of Holy Roller, which is on the flat, they're all convex. And the reason I love convexity as opposed to concavity is it doesn't collect and pool cold air. So it's more frost-free. It tends to have better airflow. So just, it really had everything I look for in a vineyard. This is kind of looking to the southwest. It gives you a little better idea of the scale of the vineyard and the way it falls away. So that's a grain elevator down in the bottom that's, probably 120 feet tall, to give you some idea.
So for those that don't know, Luss, Chris is talking about Luss. That's definitely a signature soil of Washington, a lot of parts of Washington, and many other great growing regions of the world. And it differs from region to region. For us in Washington, because we have a big basalt footprint, which is essentially what the Columbia Valley AVA is based upon, and then we have all the other sub-AVAs within, or a lot of them within, it's essentially eroded basalt. So it's erosion over time, and then it's blown by the wind. Luss is technically just a wind-blown soil, but in our case, it's very important that it's a degraded basalt, which is great because it's low in nutrients, it drains fairly well, and it also allows the roots to dig nice and deep too. So we have amazing pockets of lust in Washington, and it's really one of the key components about what makes Washington wine so great and so Washington wine-like. I mean, that's one of the key identifiers for sure.
Exactly. Yeah, to give you customers some idea, like the lust here at this site, at its shallowest spot, it's about 5 feet. On the little knoll here where I'm going to, right here where the winery is going to be built beginning next spring. And at its deepest, they're about 8 to 10 feet, and then it's over fractured basalt. So the really deep soils that the vines can really put their roots down in. You know, here at Figgins, I get, you know, because we're higher elevation and tucked right up against the mountains, I get about 22 inches of rainfall a year here. So while the soils are fairly nutrient poor, I get a bit more rainfall than a lot of parts of Eastern Washington. So we can almost dry farm this. In fact, in years where we get really good winter rainfall, we can dry farm this. And so I have slightly higher vigor. In fact, the Cabernet that's in the foreground in this picture is on what's called the Lyrae system. It's a split canopy where you have 2 cordons as opposed to 1. And it just allows for better light penetration. It's a very manually intensive process. You see how you can see between the two layers of the vine. That takes a lot of hand manipulation, a lot of wire moving, and so forth. But I get some of the smallest berries from any of my vineyards. You know, all 5 of my Leonetti vineyards, and then Figgins. These are consistently the smallest berries, which generally equates to quality because we get you know, more surface area to volume ratio, lower surface area to volume ratio, and thus a lot of skin contact and polyphenols. It's pretty sweet.
And when we talk about, you know, oh, less is great because it's low in nutrients, that may sound odd because you're like, wait, low in nutrients, but that's really what you want with viticulture because the vine is you know, the grapevine it's a vine and it wants to kind of propagate itself and just kind of spread out, right? It's a climbing plant. We want it to produce fruit. So that's the goal for us having grapevines and producing wine, right? So if you're providing an environment where it has to struggle, it puts more energy and effort into its reproductive cycle, which is the grape cluster, right? So that's why we talk about lack of nutrients being a positive thing. And also, you know, as Chris's vineyard matures and those roots dig deeper in that lust, he'll be able to dry farm, which is a huge advantage in Washington because water is a big deal. And also it'll kind of extract more a sense of the place as well. So it'd be really cool to taste this vineyard in, you know, 5, 10, 15, 20 years and beyond.
For sure. Speaking of a reproductive cycle, good cue, Chris. These are my daughters, Reagan and Scarlett. Reagan's the taller one. This is several years ago, but that's early on in the life of Figgins Vineyard. And this is actually my daughter out there we were planting. That's the start of the vineyard. And I thought I'd share these because I'm actually in Seattle right now. Even though we started harvest today at Leonetti, because I'm getting my daughter settled at Seattle Pacific University. So she's staying here and staying. I'm really excited for her. She's going to be spending the next 3 years or so up here, and hopefully get her back in the business someday. So it's a major driver for me and why I started Figgins in the first place. You know, I already had Leonetti, but I'm entrepreneurial by nature. And the reason I named it Figgins was just to honor the other side of my family. When my dad named it after his mom's side, you know, to honor that Italian side, I decided to honor the other side, and that's why I named the vineyard and the label Figgins. So hopefully she'll be running it someday.
What is she studying?
Business.
Okay.
She's doing business, and she's got a great little work ethic, and we'll see. You know what? It's interesting. When I went off to college, I actually had no intention of going into the wine business. In fact, my major was architecture and engineering, and I thought that's what I'd be doing the rest of my life. And then I fell in love with wine during college, and my dad was always smart enough to send me off to school with a case of shiners in the back of the pickup, and every time I came home, and it was a lot more interesting than drinking Coors Light and So, you know, my coming into business came out of passion, and I want that to be my, you know, the case with my kids too. I certainly won't let them do what I did, which is graduate on a Saturday and go to work in the family business on a Monday. But, you know, it's, yeah, I'll make them go see, you know, see some of the world, work for some other people. So maybe they realize working for dad's not such a bad thing. But yeah, time will tell.
And important for the development of our industry too, to have that more global perspective and experience. You know, I think that was one of the hurdles for Washington wine for a while, was that there weren't enough winemakers traveling and experiencing other ways of doing things. And I think that we do have a really, you know, rich collection of family-owned wineries and of the next generation taking those over, and that's awesome. But I think the younger generation has been much better about getting out there and learning how to make things better, rather than just relying on what was always done, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But there are, you know, it is important to look for ways on how to improve things. So I think we've really seen
for sure
the fruits of that lately.
Yeah, I've been blessed now to have like 4 trips to Bordeaux, 2 to Burgundy, like 3 to Italy, and I just you know, a lot of my best ideas come out of those trips. In fact, my daughter that I just showed the slide of, we went to Burgundy. It wasn't the whole thing, you know, we spent like 3 days in Burgundy. It wasn't a real wine focused trip, but she was, I think, 15 at the time. I was real proud of her. We tasted with Veronique Drouin, and you know, showing her 15-year-old when we were, you know, in Burgundy in this old cellar from the 15th century, you know, tasting Montrachet. It's like, hey, pay attention. Like, I didn't taste Montrachet for the first time until my 30s, you know, and I've only tasted it like, I don't know, 5 times maybe. I know it's a daily occurrence for you, Tanghe, but
no. I wish that was the
yeah,
case.
don't we all?
Yeah, I mean, I've also been really lucky in tasting a lot of amazing wines, but yeah, you need to taste those in order to see what the potential is, right? And granted, you know, we're not going to make Montrachet ever in Washington. That's not what Washington's about. But it's good to know that is out there, and that's what they do. So it's about finding out what we do, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that's really where the exciting stuff starts to happen. If you're just trying to recreate Montrachet in Washington, good luck with that.
So,
and
Chris,
that's
in
really
your
not
opinion, what do we do in Washington? If you're on the East Coast and you're giving, you know, the Washington style 101 talk, where people are trying to get their arms around, you know, Washington wines, a wall of wines, how do you describe them as a sommelier in terms of a world perspective, how they fit between, you know, compared to Napa or Bordeaux or other places they might know?
Yeah, I mean, my number one descriptor for Washington is, as I mentioned at the beginning, which is diversity. We have so many different mesoclimates and opportunities for varieties to really shine. And I think that we have done a lot of experimentation, but there's a lot more to be done because we have such flexibility, not only in mesoclimates, but just the general lack of moisture challenges. And when I say moisture challenges, I don't mean you know, availability to water, because that's definitely a challenge. I mean combating moisture in terms of rainfall, and which in turn inspires rot and different things in the vineyard. We really don't have that to worry about, which makes high quality viticulture very, very plausible, and the potential is really limitless. It's really just based upon the work that is being done in the vineyard, and the time that it takes to figure out what works and what doesn't for us in the various climates. So to give you an idea of the diversity, as I mentioned before, like, you know, sparkling, et cetera, but if you look at more kind of regional, if you were to look at, well, let's start in Walla Walla, right? Walla Walla is an amazing place because it has the diurnal shift, which is a nerdy term for just the change of temperature from day to night, which is really important when it comes to high quality wine, because you get ripening during the day, sugar development, not only that, but phenolic development, meaning all the flavor development during the day, right? And then at night, instead of it just maintaining this kind of hot climate and ripening continuing to happen and the vine is just overworked, instead it rests and it raises up the acids. So that's really the magic of Washington wine, is you get great ripeness, but also really focused wines with like a refreshing quality that balances out that ripeness. So there's actually not a ton of places that do that really, really well. You know, we could look at Argentina would be a good example of that, because of their extreme diurnal shift, because of their elevation, and their rain shadow, just like we have two rain shadows here, the Olympics and the Cascades. So we look at Walla Walla, and it has the ripening during the day and the cooling off at night, and sometimes even cooling off so much that it's a hazard, like Chris was saying before, with the way that he, you know, looked at this piece of land and the way he liked the concavity of it and how it sheds frost. That's really, really important, because especially in Walla Walla, if you're in a flatter spot, it just collects frost, and it can be a big challenge. That's actually our #1 challenge in Washington, is fighting frost, because of that immense diurnal shift, which at the end of the day,
cue, actually, you can see in the bottom of these. I have 2 wind machines there in the bottom in the Merlot, which is 1, a more sensitive variety, but 2 speaks just how much the, you know, daytime highs to nighttime lows can shift. And you know, this vineyard in particular is pretty amazing at avoiding those killer fall frosts. You might remember it happened in 2009, and then in last year, 2019, to the day, October 9th, we had basically a statewide, you could call it a frost. It was actually more of a freeze, like temperatures down to, you know, 25 degrees, that nipped most of the state. This vineyard actually did not frost. And part of that was, you know, we did run those wind machines, but it's just the high elevation and the way it slopes is pretty amazing. But, you know, and part of the reason we get those big shifts is we have very low humidities, really low. In fact, I'm looking right now at Figgins on my weather stations, and 17% relative humidity, which is crazy low. You know, it's just really dry. So the air, you know, you go to Bordeaux, it's probably 60% right now, and the air is just doesn't have that resistance to change. It wants to cool down at night, which is really a defining factor in how we get such great acidity and tannin and thick skins that we get at the Figgins site.
And also on that topic of water, so it helps to combat, you know, lack of water, combats contributes to lack of fungus, et cetera, but also it contributes to wine quality. There's been a lot of studies done showing how and when a vine gets water really, really has a huge impact on the finished quality. So since we have such great control over moisture and water rainfall in Washington, being that it's so dry, we control when the vine gets water and how much. And that really boosts quality so much, and also provides consistency from vintage to vintage. So really our biggest vintage variation is frost. I mean, if you can avoid frost being in a great site like this, or have the technology of wind fans at play, then you can really, you know, all you have to worry about is fine tuning the viticulture and watering at the right times to make sure that you have concentration in the wines. You're forcing that vine to struggle a bit, but you're not choking it out either. You're not creating water stress. So the more control you have over that, the higher quality of the wine. Yeah,
we really do get to, you know, play God with our rainfall, if you will. You know, it hasn't rained in Walla Walla since I think about the 10th of June. We haven't had a drop of rain. And that's pretty common. I mean, usually we'll have, you know, some thunderstorms the first week or 2 of June that bring some rainfall. And then from then on out, it's usually not until, you know, we'll get maybe 1 in October rainstorm that's quickly moving through, but typically November is when our rainy season starts. So the Cascade rain shadow is legit, and it really does wring out all the moisture, and we're left with the dry side over there. So, hey, any of those of you who might have joined us late, please use the chat feature to ask questions, and about 5-10 minutes here, we'll get to answering some questions. Chris, why don't you give your perspective, just, you know, in terms of, you know, what my dad started. Obviously, you've been studying and based here in Washington for quite some time on Leonetti and then subsequently Figgins and your general thoughts on kind of the history of the Washington wine industry and how it's just become so ingrained here in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, Leonetti's always been what we'd call an icon producer. It was one of the wineries that put Washington on the map, and your dad got at it real early and really paved the path for a lot of people that are making wine today. And I think it's the gold standard for Merlot in particular, which was kind of the first wine that was I was exposed to, and that was talked about and written up and scored high. And I think it's kind of an unsung hero of Washington a little bit, is Merlot as well as Riesling. A lot of people don't realize that we make some really awesome Rieslings too. And you're making wine at Figgins, right?
Yeah, I've got a tiny bit. I've got like an acre and a quarter, acre and a half. It's one little piece of the vineyard folds over to the northwest and kind of sits in a draw. So since my dad started with Riesling, Leonetti, very few people know that. We made a Riesling in, I think, 78 to 83, I think. My parents made some white Riesling, as if there's any other kind but white Riesling, but it was labeled white Riesling for some reason, yeah. But instead of just Riesling. But so yeah, I do make a little dry Riesling off the Figgins site, which is, somewhat unusual to have Bordeaux varieties and Riesling, right, side by side. But obviously the red's the focus, but we also make Riesling. And then Filia, which is a Petit Verdot Merlot blend. So.
Yeah, so that's my exposure to Leonetti, and I mean, everyone knows the name Leonetti. I mean, you go anywhere and mention Leonetti, and they sometimes they know the winery, but they don't know where it's from. I've experienced that, and that's changing, thankfully. But and that's not a bad thing necessarily, but at least they'll discover at some point that it's from Washington. But that's pretty remarkable that you have that experience and that you have that influence in your life. I think that's rad.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many times, especially like on the East Coast, that I've had, I'm at a trade tasting or whatever, and Leonetti, like you said, they know the name, but then they're like, now you guys are in Napa, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, if I had a nickel, and it's like, no, we're about 700 miles from there. But
I mean, it's kind of a compliment, right? Like, especially for a person that doesn't know wine that well.
Yeah.
I mean, to put you in the same class as Napa, that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
We're getting there.
Getting there.
Yeah, like I said before, like it is, especially in the profession, no doubt, no question, in the professional community, everyone knows about Washington, knows the virtues of it, is a huge fan. It's still some work to be done on the consumer side, but that's the world of wine is huge. It's massive. There's so many regions, and I think that Washington's doing pretty darn well. And in large part of that is due to obviously great wines that are being made, like Chris is doing, but also the work of the Washington Wine Commission. They do a really phenomenal job in marketing Washington wine. They have a really awesome team, and I'm continually impressed with the work that they do. And I've been lucky enough to work with them on a number of projects, and they've been putting in the time and have been super creative and have done nothing but really great things for Washington wine.
Yeah, no question whatsoever. So we're lucky to have them.
Yeah.
So let's see. Let's get to a few questions. Carly, you want to join us and hop on and moderate some questions?
Let's see here.
There's Carly. Nice background. I wish it was that clear in Walla Walla today.
I know. Yeah, I figured it looks a little nicer than the actual sky right now.
Right.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for sending in some questions. So Chris, I'm just going to roll through a few of these so you guys can elaborate as you want to. First one, I love the trees and their meandering river-like formation. What type are they, and did you pick them for a specific reason?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad someone liked that. So those are they're sycamores. Technically, they're London plane trees. And I planted them for a few reasons. I've always found them to be I love the architecture of them. And there's a lot of them in Walla Walla. In fact, I think the state record, actually think the US record sycamore is in Pioneer Park near downtown Walla Walla. If you ever have a chance, if you're visiting Walla Walla for a wine tour, drive through Pioneer Park. It's really phenomenal. The same guy who designed Central Park in New York, I forget his name, some landscape architect, designed Pioneer Park. It's obviously much smaller, but there's these amazing old sycamores in the center of the park around a gazebo that are pretty phenomenal. So I planted those because I've always loved the tree. The way it's laid out, that's the road, coming up to the vineyard site that'll be built next spring. And I like that you like the meander because it took a lot of doing. When I laid that out, I was trying to, work with the topography that I had. And I kept, out in the wheat stubble, like laying out flags, trying to get, and then I'd look at it from various angles on the property of the flags that I laid. And no, that's not quite right. Make the belly of this a little more. And it's just, when I design vineyards, there's a lot of feng shui type of thought that goes into it to make them super functional, but also beautiful, because I think it should be. It's there's the linear nature of it, and then to have the meandering trees is supposed to be a softening element, and that's how I approach that. Those trees they're about 1 year away, maybe 2 years away from being pollarded, pollarding is a technique you see used a lot in Europe along boulevards, where once the trees are to a mature size, they're spur pruned just like a grapevine, so they never get beyond that size. If anyone's been to, Paris and seen that famous view of the Eiffel Tower with trees on both sides, those are pollarded London plane trees, same thing. So that's the idea. If I let them get too big, as they'll get in Walla Walla, I'll get shade in the vineyard that I don't want. So great question. By the way, they're a super duper mess in the fall, so taking volunteers to rake leaves.
Someone said Olmsted ? And you're absolutely right. It is Olmsted.
Olmsted, nice.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Oh wow, this is a good question. I got one that just popped in. Prior to the pandemic situation this year, there seemed to be a consensus that there's an oversupply in the industry, particularly in California. And perhaps we were at the top of the cycle. Napa Sonoma seemed to be seeing some slackening of DTC, tasting, etc. Now with the pandemic, there's another huge factor. Are you feeling this? How do you think this is impacting Washington wine?
That's a doozy.
That's a good one.
Yeah, good question.
Thanks,
So,
Bart.
there is an oversupply in California, Oregon, Washington, and it's a function of several things, a little bit of changing demographic drinking habits, but just, I think, overzealous industry a little bit. And, that tends to be common in almost virtually all perennial agricultural crops is, times are good, people plant, it gets overplanted, some comes out. So we shall see. But, in terms of how COVID has affected, business in the industry, it has just shifted things. We feel very blessed to be having a good year. But obviously we've had to give our distributors a little more discretion. We're fortunate in that we are primarily and have always been a direct-to-consumer business. You guys are what make kind of butter our bread and keep us ticking. So, so having restaurants closed certainly affects us, but not as bad as a lot of wineries might be affected. This year, 2019, we had really poor weather at Bloom, so we have we didn't have that great a set, meaning we have low yields. So, and that's across the state. So I think that'll help with some of the oversupply, to be sure. What else am I missing in that question, Carly? Address everything?
You did really well. It actually ties in another question that ties right into what you just said is someone asked what the 2020 vintage was looking like so far in terms of quality. So you can answer that also.
Yeah, for sure. I think qualitatively, I think it'll be very good. we have a light crop, but that typically is very good for quality. When you have poor set, the cluster is the size that it is when it blooms. But when you have poor set, it means your berries are spaced out further on that rachis, on that stem. And so you get more airflow, more light flow through there, which tends to equal, darker berries and really high quality wines. So, we normally do what's called green harvesting, where we fruit thin. We'll drop, costs us money to literally drop fruit on the ground. And this year we didn't have to do very much thinning whatsoever, just because crops are so light to begin with. So Mother Nature kind of did it for us. But I have a bit of trepidation about the smoke, definitely in Willamette Valley for my Toil, Oregon project. But in Walla Walla too, the smoke's been coming and going, from as far away as California, now from the Oregon fires. Distance tends to help a lot in terms of we've never had smoke taint in our wines, and hopefully this year's no exception. So we just literally started the harvest at Leonetti today. Figgins is probably 10 days away from our first pick. So looks like we're going to get some good weather Monday, Tuesday. We're getting a little onshore push. It's going to even drop some precipitation, which would be a godsend to everyone, right? Firefighters and just us citizens breathing the air. So yeah, great question. High hopes for the vintage. It's been a really nice, besides the smoke coming and going these last few weeks, it's been a nice summer. We had June was, when we were in bloom, we called January, the first 2 weeks. It's just cold. And, but then July was pretty mild. We haven't had any of the big hot heat waves that have lasted more than a day or two. So pretty nice vintage.
You got a couple people shouting out that they're drinking some Filia tonight during this webinar. Do you want to shed a little light on why Filia? Why'd you add it to the lineup?
Yeah. So Filia means daughter in Italian. In my case, specifically, two daughters. I have two daughters, and with the 2016 vintage, which was a generous vintage yield-wise, I always have leftover wine from Figgins. We tend to only bottle like 60 to 70% of what we produce, so we can just make the blend as awesome as possible for the estate red. And some of the leftover wine in 16 was so good, we started playing with alternative blends and started playing with Cabernet free blends, specifically Merlot and Petit Verdot. Ended up doing a 50-50 Merlot Petit Verdot blend that just worked awesome, and decided to bottle some of it. So that's become Filia, named after my two daughters, representing the two varieties, Merlot and Petit Verdot. And that's what that's all about. So they go together really well. Merlot's so fat. Merlot's all about flesh and fat and mid-palate and fruit. And Petit Verdot is more of a masculine. It's a linear front to back. It can be tannic and acidic type variety, and the two marry really well together. So that's the story of Filia. It's a little friendlier price point as well than the Figgins Estate Red.
Can you compare the 16 and 17 Figgins Estate Red? That's a great question, because we just released the 17 this week.
Yep. Yeah, so the 16 is especially as Figgins Estate Vineyard goes, is a very soft vintage. If I were to if I'm the most sitting in front of me tonight, I would definitely open the 16 first, and not just because it's a year older. It was softer on release. 17 is more classic Figgins. It's a mountain site, 1,700 feet, right up against the mountains. Makes these big, long-aged wines that can be fairly tight and high-strung in their youth, and they tend to show awesome like in year 5. There's a reason we release it later. The Figgins 17s, or the Leonetti 17s all come out in the spring, and we don't release the Figgins till fall. And, it's because it needs the extra time. So the 16 is definitely a softer vintage. We had some rains at harvest that softened tannins. The 17 is more classic Figgins. It reminds me a lot of the 15, that 13, 14, 15 window right in there. And for drinking today, 16, is the one, 2012 is the one, 2009 is the one. All three of those vintages are drinking awesome. And 2008, if you have it. There wasn't much 2008, but it's drinking awesome as well right now. That was the inaugural vintage.
So we got one to both of you. If you're not drinking Figgins or Leonetti, what do you drink? Harrison Hill?
Yeah, I'll drink some Harrison Hill. I love that wine. It's delicious. Ages a super long time and awesome vine material. I'm sure our answer is gonna be a little bit different. I drink all sorts of stuff. I mean, I drink a lot of Washington because I'm here and I love it, but I also, work in education. So I get to drink a lot of things all the time. What I like to drink at home, honestly, is if I could drink Chablis Premier Cru every day, I would. That's just kind of my wine. Dry Riesling, or even off dry, depending on what I'm eating. Man, I don't know. Cabernet Franc. There's so many delicious wines. We live in the golden age of wines. Okay, winemaking has never been better. Viticulture has never been better. Availability has never been as broad as it is now. So, my advice is just make sure you drink the stuff you like, of course, but also experiment. Buy something to drink that you've never had before and see what you think. Just because there's so much out there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great answer, Chris. For me, also being in the industry, I'm exposed to a lot of different wines, and I trade wines with various people, but I drink, living in Walla Walla, we have 4 very distinct seasons, and I tend to drink very seasonally, from June through now, till it cools down. And my partner, Jennifer, and I, we drink a lot of whites, a lot of rosé, Pinot Noir, Sangiovese, lighter wines throughout the summertime, because, they tend to complement more of what we're eating, which is, more vegetables and in the garden and things like that. And then usually October, when things start cooling off, I just start jonesing for big reds, and so I obviously drink a lot of things from Walla Walla. There's so many great wines that come, from throughout the state in Walla Walla. And, my desert island wine is probably Brunello, and I just love Brunello, Sangiovese from Italy, Montalcino area, and I absolutely love that wine. I love Barolo as well, Nebbiolo from northern Italy, and I wish I could afford to drink more fine Bordeaux, but it's, out of a winemaker's price range these days. It's just gotten so insane, the first and second growth, that not drinking a lot of that. But I just drink all over the place. I think it's important as a winemaker that I don't focus on one wine or one type of wine, that I'm always, drinking a broad spectrum out of that wine rainbow, and keeps you with an open mind and a fresh palate, and not a cellar palate. Really important.
So I have 2. One is specifically about Figgins and ageability, Chris. So what's your recommendation for cellaring these wines? Obviously vintage variations. And the second one is actually about plantings of Sangiovese in Washington. Just planted it at Lake Helene. Do you have any plans for Sangiovese at Figgins?
So general ageability of Figgins, the wines off this vineyard are gonna go a long time. They're gonna be right there with, Leonetti Reserve and Cabernets. If you, if you want to age them, 30 plus years, they're gonna do it. I'm very confident of that, even though obviously I don't have that long a track record yet. 2008 being the first vintage, but I'm really just confident in the wine style and the balance that's in them, that they'll age a long time. With the exception of the vintages I mentioned, like 16, 12, 9, I don't think you should really get into them hard. I mean, pop one, if you order a case, by all means, have one, enjoy it in its youth. But, wait till like year 6 or 7 of the vintage date before you really start getting into them. They're very age-worthy wines. I'd be curious what Chris has to say on that, just what he perceives stylistically. But Sangiovese, no, I have no plans to plant Sangio at Figgins. I love my Sangio that we do at Leonetti. It's a blast. But love our vineyard sites and sources that we have for that. We grow it out at in a Holy Roller vineyard and at Luss and at our Upland vineyard, and it's pretty awesome. But we've just kind of got our production stabilized, so no plans of Sangio. But interestingly, I probably drink more Pinot Noir and Sangio at home than I do all of our other big reds, which is interesting. Speaks to my palate a bit.
Chris, when was Sangio planted for Leonetti?
Our first Sangio went in the ground in 92 or 93. First vintage released was 95. That was a fun story. My dad actually, we started that, obviously, we're a Bordeaux house, but we started the Sangiovese. Just my dad always had a love of Italian wines and being Italian heritage. He got the budwood from Robert Pepe in Napa, who had got it from Biondisanti's El Greppo vineyard in Brunello. So it's a Grosso clone off of Biondisanti, and it's a great grape. I absolutely love it. Really fun to grow. Maybe the most fun grapevine to grow, just because it's just beautiful to look at. It's fun to farm, and really a blast. Enjoyable wines to make.
It makes sense. If you ever been to Tuscany, the climate, well, they're much closer to a sea in Tuscany than say Walla Walla would be. Still, it's quite arid and similar landscape. Still is a little bit different, of course, but I could see why Sangio was thought of early. But reality is we can grow anything we want, really.
Yeah, absolutely. We got any last questions, Carly?
I think we're pretty well wrapped up, unless anybody
Awesome.
wants to jump in with anything you want to know at the very end. Otherwise, I think if you guys want to wrap it up, thank you both for your time tonight. I'm sure everybody learned a lot. I know I did. Everyone says thank you.
Glad to have Carly on here. She doesn't get a lot of credit or glory that she should. She's works her butt off and is on the phone a lot with you guys. We love offering concierge level service, and Carly does it admirably. Awesome. The other person who gives is my sister Amy, who's just a spit wad away across the office from Carly. So thank you, Carly, for everything you do.
You bet.
So thank you guys for joining. Loved having you. We're breaking ground next spring, finally. Got delayed a year with COVID on the winery. That'll go, if you can see my cursor, like right there at the end of the road, it's going to be fantastic. It'll be the first dug excavated caves in Washington State, which I'm really excited about. And it's going to be an awesome customer experience. So it'll be about a 1.5 year long build. So get it on your calendars, but hopefully in 2020, no, not two, Carly, for breaking ground 2021. 2023, Figgins release weekend in October, we'll have that open and ready to celebrate. So looking forward to it. Yeah, thanks for joining us, you guys. Cheers, everyone. Thanks for joining us, Chris. I appreciate your time.
Of course, anytime.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
All right, be well.
All right, see ya.
Take care, all. Ciao.